enthusiastic kind of, or do I need an introduction? Okay, I need no introduction. All right, thank you. Who are you guys anyway? Who the hell are you? What is this SSDP?
We're at Imperial, and
yeah, we're the Students for Sensible Drug Policy Society. We started it this year since we didn't actually have a chapter in Imperial yet.
You didn't?
No, right.
And everyone's always raving about you, and we really wanted to get you in, so I'm really excited to be able to host you now.
You see all my books behind me? I hope you're buying some of them. I'll tap my head, you can read them all. Subliminal advertising there. Right, let's get started then. Thanks for the invite. And I'm a great supporter of the SSDP. They were one of the, I think maybe the first organization to ask me to speak after this happened. After I got sacked as the government chief advisor, I was invited to the SSDP conference, which was in Leeds. And it was an absolute pleasure to go and talk to them. And they've been, and you, of course, as part of them, have been great supporters ever since. So this is me being sacked, 2009, for telling the truth about drugs. And you can see the book of cannabis falling from my hand, and you can see the scales of justice. I was saying that beer and fags are much more problematic than those green chemicals in the little plastic bags. And that wasn't an argument the government wanted to hear, so they tried to shut me up. And that man's hand over my mouth is the Home Secretary, Alan Johnson. And one of my friends very helpfully sent me this quote from Voltaire afterwards, saying, it is, David, didn't you know, haven't you read your Voltaire? It is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. The only difference is, in these days, I didn't get the guillotine, which I would have done, of course, if I'd been in France during the revolution. Okay, so after that bit of entertainment, I have argued for a very long time that there are 7 major flaws in current policies around drugs: criminalization, punishment-based, prohibition-based policies. And I'll just go through them quickly, but I'm not going to talk about really almost any of them except the ones that are highlighted. So it's biased against some drugs. Alcohol is not controlled, tobacco is not controlled, so it's dishonest and immoral. It's directed by political rather than health concerns. Almost all the drug laws are politically determined. It puts punishment above harm reduction, which is another moral choice. The punishments are completely disproportionate to harms. I mean, the fact you can be executed in many countries around the world for possessing small amounts of drugs is truly disproportionate to the harms they do. They severely limit treatment in research, which are the hidden casualties, the basis of my talk. And they encourage the use of more toxic compounds, which I'll talk about very briefly. And it wastes a huge amount of money that could be better spent improving the lives of millions of people. So I'm just going to focus on 5 and 6, but I'm going to kick off with 6 because just to get it out of the way. And one of the things we have known since about 1910, when the first of the Opium Acts came in, that if you stop people accessing a drug which is has some harms but not maximal harms, people often, generally in fact, switch to using drugs which are more harmful. So when we really clamped down on smoking opium because we wanted to victimize the Chinese immigrants, well, people started injecting morphine and heroin, which is considerably worse. Ethanol prohibition led to the rise of hooch and methanol, much more toxic. Also to the rise of the organized crime. Cannabis, the trying to eliminate cannabis from prisons has led to the rise of synthetics, which are much more toxic. To some extent, cocaine prohibition has led to crack. MDMA prohibition led to many deaths from supposed false MDMAs like PMA and PMMA. LSD, psilocybin led to the rise of the M-bombs, which are more toxic. And OxyContin in the States led to the rise of heroin and fentanyl. And you can, if you want to learn more about any of this, you can read the book, Drugs Out the Hot Air, which I think is up there somewhere. Or you can go to my talk on the Drug Science website, which is called A Groundhog Decade. But I just want to share this with you, because this is really, truly one of the greatest natural experiments in the history of the world. Completely accidental experiment, but it proves convincingly that prohibition fails. So what you see here are deaths in America from a whole range of different opiates. So any opioid, synthetic opioids like fentanyls, commonly prescribed opioids in purple, like morphine and OxyContin, etc. And then heroin. And heroin was made illegal in America in 1948 because they believed that stopping the prescription of it would reduce the recreational use. Of course, it had no impact on recreational use. But what's interesting here is that so heroin has been illegal for the whole length of that of that x-axis, and it's been killing a few people, but not very many. And then suddenly there's a massive upturn in 2010. Why was that? Well, that was because the purple bar went flat. That's because the Americans got rather concerned about prescription opioids. So having overprescribed prescription opioids, seen a massive rise in deaths from prescription opioids going back from 2000. This is a pretty good rise, 4- or 5-fold rise, and that's due to the overpromotion of things like OxyContin. And then the reaction was, let's prohibit it. Let's stop people prescribing OxyContin. And what happens when you do that is that people go into withdrawal. When they go into withdrawal, they have a very altered motivational system, so they want to get something to replenish their missing opioids. And you see, the first thing they did, interestingly, was turn to heroin. And they weren't getting that from doctors because that's illegal. So the heroin deaths started to rise because that's what they knew to get. But then, in its sort of infinite stupidity, the United Nations and decided to cut back on the production of the precursors of heroin, the growth of themane in India, to try to stop the misuse of heroin. So what happened then? You see exactly what happened then. 4 years later, particularly the Mexican cartels who were supplying most of the opiates to America realized there was another opiate they could make, which was called fentanyl. But fentanyl is fully synthetic. You don't have to grow poppies to make fentanyl. And so they suddenly hit upon a drug which they could have hit upon 40 years ago because fentanyl's been around that long, but they hadn't known about it or cared about it until the attempt was made to stop them making heroin. And they realized that fentanyl is 50 times more potent and half the cost to make. So you've got about 100 times better profitability from fentanyl than from heroin. And now you see this massive rise. So last year, more people died of fentanyl in America than died in the whole of the Vietnam War. And that's all because we have a completely absurd policy relating to all these drugs. But that just emphasizes the way in which the toxicity of drugs tends to rise. And fentanyls are the most toxic drugs known to man. And I mean, fentanyl itself is, as I say, 50 times more powerful than heroin. Carfentanil, which is only used to sort of bring down rhinos and elephants, is 1,000 times more potent than that. It's so potent, people who make it don't even know how to weigh it out safely. So you've got deaths, accidental deaths from there were 1,000 different fentanyls discovered in the last few years. So it's it's just a complete and utter nightmare, all predicated on this utterly ridiculous way in which the Americans have tried to deal with their opiate problem. And of course, we're going to get it. We're going to get the same thing because fentanyl is so cheap and cheerful, and heroin is going through, and especially now, the Taliban are actually going to wipe out most of the illegal heroin in the world. There's going to be everyone's going to switch to fentanyls, and we're going to have thousands of deaths from fentanyls in Britain as well. I can predict in a couple of years. Okay, so that's just a happy start. But let's talk about the lost opportunities, which are even more damaging than the harms that prohibition has done. And it really centers around the fact that many of the drugs that are banned have potential as treatments. In fact, many of them were treatments before they were banned. So we got cannabis for pain, sleep, spasticity, epilepsy, cancer, PTSD, ecstasy for PTSD, Parkinson's disease perhaps, psilocybin and other psychedelics for depression, OCD, cluster headaches, LSD for terminal illnesses, addictions, massive health problems, many of them very massive, many of them as big as things like cancer. And yet these drugs are not being studied because the regulations make them almost impossible to research. And this lost opportunity is the subject of my talk. So here's the historical narrative, really, that shows you how, what proves the point I'm making, the opportunity has been lost. So this graph looks at the number of publications each year in blue for LSD and in red for psilocybin, magic mushroom juice. And you can see massive rise in the number of publications for LSD in the 50s and 60s, largely because the US government funded about 140 separate trials with LSD, 40,000 patients, 1,000 papers were published. But then in 1967 in America, 1971 in the rest of the world, these drugs were banned as part of Nixon's war on drugs. And you see the precipitate fall in output. After a couple of years of people writing up the papers they've already got the data on, the number of publications virtually disappeared. There were years in the 90s when no one published a single paper on psilocybin. And there are two reasons for that. One was from 67 on, the US government ceased to fund any work on these drugs. And secondly, even if you could get funding to do the research, it was virtually impossible to get hold of the drugs because they were controlled as Schedule 1 as being too dangerous to use, and they were blocked away, and it was virtually, they were effectively banned. And I think there was a deliberate ploy by regulators and by politicians and by the United Nations to eliminate. They actually thought they could eliminate psychedelics in the same way as they're trying to eliminate vaping for nicotine, and make people forget that they ever existed. But we're fighting back. You can see in 2016, the psilocybin starts to rise, and it's gone up quite a lot since then, not least of which, or at least we've contributed significantly to that. Just a few things that people don't know about psychedelics, or often don't know, is that they were very influential in science. So here, these are the two most important Nobel Prizes in medicine and physiology. There's Crick at the top, with Jim Watson, got the Nobel Prize for decoding DNA, and Mullis, who was trying to work out how to use DNA to study DNA, very difficult to get hold of, to make it. And eventually, under an LSD trip, he realized what he had to do was to replicate one of the helices, and replicate it. He saw it replicating like serpents under his trip. And then he went out and found an enzyme that did that. It's called polymerase, and he got the Nobel Prize because PCR, of course, underpins all life sciences and all food science, etc. And he said, I wouldn't have got the Nobel Prize if I hadn't seen how to achieve my goal through LSD. Now, Crick was rather different because Crick had got the Nobel Prize before he tried LSD, and after he tried it, he realized that actually discovering the building blocks of life was actually pretty trivial because he'd done it. What he realized is he couldn't understand how his mind worked, and he spent the rest of his life trying to understand his mind. LSD changed the whole way in which he thought about science. But of course, they did that when they were legal, and in fact, one of the reasons Crick left Britain and went to the States was because the police in Cambridge were giving him a hard time for using LSD after it was banned in Britain in '68. Cannabis was also suffered the same kind of restrictions of access, not for quite as long. You see only about 20-year hiatus, 30-year hiatus maybe, in terms of research outputs. And so the upswing there came sooner than with the psychedelics because the US states decided that cannabis was a medicine and allowed more access. There's still a huge loss of opportunity. So we've got 50-year loss with psychedelics, a 30-year loss with cannabis. And taken together, that's the worst censorship of research in the history of the world, I think. The best example I can come up with which might compare was in 1616 when the Catholic Church banned the writings of Copernicus. And now you're all scientifically minded people. You all know that Copernicus was the guy that worked out that the Earth was not the center of the universe. In fact, the Earth went around the sun. And that conflicted with the Catholic Church's teachings. And they stopped anyone reading his books. They executed people like Bruno, who spoke about the new insights into the universe. And they gave Galileo the choice of, recant or die when he talked about the moons of Jupiter. Now that ban lasted 100 142 years. The ban on psychedelics is lasted for 55 and still going. And the Catholic ban didn't actually extend to non-Catholic countries, so the Northern European Protestants could keep on looking at the skies with impunity. Whereas every country in the world, I think except North Korea, has endorsed the ban on research on psychedelics and cannabis. And there weren't that many astronomers in those days, handfuls probably, but there are hundreds of thousands of doctors and neuroscientists who've been denied access to psychedelics and cannabis as a result of those laws. So that's why I say it's way the worst research in the history of the world. If you want to read more about it, here's a couple of papers I've written. The one in Nature Reviews looks at the origins of the laws and covers cannabis and ketamine as well, and MDMA as well as psychedelics. The PLOS Biology one largely focuses on psychedelics. And here's an interesting aspect of the censorship. So when I was asked by Nature Reviews Neuroscience, which is the leading neuroscience review journal, to write an article about drug laws and research, I approached a colleague in America who was actively working in this field, or trying to, and said, great news, we got a chance to really lay out our stall. We can write the definitive review, castigating the policies of the last 50 years. And they said to me, well, Dave, that's great news, but if I joined you in writing that, I would never get a grant from NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse again. If I attacked them for their policy in the last 50 years, I would never get another grant. And that tells you that it is censorship, it's active censorship. It's a deliberate attempt to stop people working with these drugs. And that emphasizes the point I've been making before. These decisions of banning are political decisions, and almost all the research that's been allowed on drugs, particularly like MDMA, has been centered around trying to find harms rather than trying to find use. So in fact, that Nature Reviews paper must have the oldest average age of any authors for Nature Reviews in the history of the world. Because when I wrote that, I was 62, Les King was 72, and Dave Nichols was, I think, 70. So only people who were basically retired had the confidence to write it. But things are changing. So let's talk about psychedelics a bit, and then talk about other drugs. So you're probably all aware about the history of psychedelics and the massive use of them in many cultures, going from Native American cultures, Mexican and other cultures around the world with magic mushrooms, ayahuasca in Latin America, Amanita muscaris in the Caucasus in Siberia, the muscimol-containing mushroom, and morning glory seeds and ergot, which contain LSD-like substances. And this is perhaps the most important image. This is an image of the Greek god Demeter partaking of ergot and wine, and that's a powerful combination. It was used to fuel the Greek Eleusinian mysteries, the great celebrations of music, art, dance, which the Greeks engaged in once the cereals started to grow their fungus that made the ergot derivatives. And I think you can make a reasonable case that the insights that psychedelics gave to the ancient Greeks could well have been the founding underpinning of all their developments in the fields of mathematics, obviously trigonometry, philosophy, and also, of course, democracy. And most of the Western world is based on those insights and principles developed from ancient Greece. So maybe psychedelics underpinned Western society, just as other psychedelics probably underpinned many other societies, such as cannabis in Hinduism. And for those of you who may not know this, there's a very interesting idea that Shiva got insights into the nature of life and how to behave through sleeping under a cannabis bush and being intoxicated by the resins that fell from it. And today there are religious groups like the Sadhus in India that basically are stoned all the time on cannabis, and they're seen as having very special insights into life, and are supported for that purpose. And the whole concept of soma, the foundations of Hinduism, which must be a powerful drug if it gives people the idea that 4 arms is generally more common than 2, was probably a mixture of cannabis, magic mushrooms, and ephedra, the stimulant. But I want to come back now to Imperial College and to Great Britain. So the reason Imperial College is called Imperial College is because we were an imperial nation, and we basically colonized, as you probably know, about half the world. One of the reasons we did that was because we could exploit the natural resources of those countries. In fact, Imperial College itself was built largely on the proceeds of exploitation, and that exploitation was in natural products, but also in drugs. And the British government's way the largest drug dealer in the history of the world, because we forced the Chinese to buy opium, which we grew in India and then sold to the Chinese. The Chinese didn't want to buy it, so we had 2 wars with China to force them to buy opium from us, and that was to counterbalance the fact we were buying tea from them. And in India, where cannabis grows wild, we forced the Indians to buy only the cannabis which was made under government or East India Company control. So that made us a lot of money too. But that began to create a little discontent. There was certainly some moral people in British society who, having overturned slavery, began to think about whether what we were doing to the colonies was actually fair and equitable. And in 1893, the Indian Hemp Commission was founded because there were politicians who thought we were actually deliberately making Indians addicted to cannabis so they would buy our product. A debate about what we should do about drugs, and that's really where the founding basis of prohibition in the West came. But of course, prohibition has existed before in other non-Western cultures, and in fact, it really started in about the 7th century with Islam, and it started with the banning of alcohol under the Quran, and Islam also tried to certainly ban cannabis. It tried to ban coffee and tobacco without any success, I think, because people couldn't be so, it wasn't so detectable and people weren't intoxicated. But the rationale for the banning alcohol and cannabis in the Quran is the fact that it allows people to have an inauthentic interaction with the gods, so they can pretend that they're being a good person, but they're not. It was a few centuries later, in the 1800s, that the banning of a range of other drugs like cannabis and opiates came along, and that was rather unfortunate, because there had been from the early 1800s a dramatic increased use, an understanding of the value, particularly of cannabis products in the West. And this man, William O'Shaughnessy, was a doctor in India, saw the value of India of medical cannabis, brought it back to Britain, particularly with a focus on infantile spasms in epilepsy, and sold it for many, many reasons, many uses. And it was very popular medicine. In fact, the Queen's physician, J. Russell Reynolds, wrote an enormous text. You see, they go 50 pages in the Lancet. It's a textbook of cannabis in the leading medical journal in the world, arguing how powerful and useful medical cannabis was. And Queen Victoria was prescribed it for period pains and the pains of childbirth, and she wrote quite positively about the experience. And it was legal in Britain until 1971, and then in 1971 it was banned. It was banned almost certainly, although I can't prove it, because of pressure from the US. It had banned it in 1934 as a medicine, and they were very angry that we carried on keeping it as a medicine, even though they banned it. They banned it as a medicine, thinking it would stop recreational use. Ho, ho, ho. But we didn't until 71 when we did. And the argument we used was that some doctors were prescribing medical cannabis and allowing people to smoke it. Now, that's the only drug that's ever been banned because doctors prescribed it badly. I mean, that was just a smokescreen for succumbing to American pressure. And lots of other drugs were quite readily available in those days. Cocaine, here you go, Miss Winslow's soothing syrup for teeth. I have little doubt that actually, it's a bit of cocaine was certainly stuff a baby whinging about to take. And here's heroin. Heroin was used for various kinds of pains, and also for cough. It was and is still a very powerful cough suppressant. And there's also quite a popular use of drugs which we would now call polydrugs. Vin Mariani, popular French tonic wine. You got alcohol and cocaine, and endorsed even by the Pope. What it was, I can't remember which Pope that is. I can't read it. You can probably read it better than I can. One of the popes endorsed it. It was said he was probably addicted to it, but it was legal. And Pope Leo XIII, there you go. And then Prohibition began to set in. And Prohibition began in about the 1880s. It began with the Puritan temperance movements who were anti-everything. They wanted to ban alcohol. They wanted to ban every other drug. And they started with the smaller drugs, the less popular ones like cannabis and morphine and cocaine that you could get in those tinctures from your local pharmacy. And eventually, of course, they succeeded in getting alcohol banned in the States in 1922 and also in other countries like Norway and Sweden. And as I've said already, political expediency, that's always been a major underpinning factor in terms of controlling drugs, and I'll come back to that later. And then there were competing commercial interests. The alcohol industry was always scared of other drugs, and the pharmaceutical industry, particularly the German pharmaceuticals, that were making lots of money taking natural products, finding the active ingredient, making a small chemical change and then patenting it, were very anti people going back to the original natural products. So for things like aspirin is salicylic. It's a form of aspirin is found in willow bark, salicylic acid used for thousands of years to deal with pain. Bayer took salicylic acid, added an acetyl group, acetyl salicylic acid. Oh, that's aspirin. Now we can patent it. And they were selling aspirin. They're still making it. Still one of their biggest sellers today, after 200 years nearly. And yet but they managed to stop people using natural products, and that was particularly relating to cannabis and morphine. One of the drivers to get rid of opium use was so that the pharmaceutical companies could just sell synthetic variants or extracted variants of the opiate poppy. And then there's Harry Anslinger from the DEA, who came in to protect America from the problems of prohibition, which of course was self-created, the rise of the mafia. Prohibition corrupted every policeman in America, so they had to invent their own army, which we now call the Drug Enforcement Agency, to fight the illegal alcohol trade. And it worked for about 11 years. The battle went on. Eventually, the Senate said, "No, this is stupid. Alcohol's not that bad, and it's not as bad as the harms that the prohibition had caused." And poor old Harry was left with the reality that he had 35,000 men who were going to lose their jobs. So he decided to find another drug that was a threat to America, which he called marijuana, and the rest is kind of history. Yeah, I've mentioned this already, but I'll just say a little bit more about the pharmaceutical takeover of natural products. So I've already talked to you about opium and aspirin from willow bark, but there's also amphetamine, ephedra, the ephedra plant, which grows in East Africa alongside the coffee plant. It produces this stimulant ephedra, which is the first treatment for asthma. And unfortunately, it was so good that there was a shortage of ephedra for treating asthma. And a synthetic version of ephedra was made, which was called amphetamine. And that really dominated the market. And again, the companies were keen not to have herbal remedies. And one of the things they tried to do with cannabis, but less successfully, was to make THC the active ingredient in medicine. But it's actually quite a difficult thing to medicalize THC because it's oily liquid, so they couldn't turn it into the pills like other things they'd done. But they have still, and there's still a battle. The companies that make pure THC and pure cannabidiol are trying to stop the rest of the world using medical cannabis, which is probably better because they're using sort of arguments about patent infringement. So here's Harry, here's the rise of the mafia, here's the Untouchables, and confronted with losing his job and his army, he decided to attack cannabis. And of course, he did it in the classic way, the classic all-American racist way: you blame Mexicans. So he blamed Mexicans for bringing cannabis across the border, and stoned Mexicans were raping white women, and Mexicans were giving cannabis to young white men and were dropping out of school and engaging in these terrible orgies. And you can see it's absolutely, these are just the classic scurrilous way in which you encourage people to get an interest in drugs, but also to be disapproving of drugs. You get older, middle-aged and older people wanting to see semi-naked women, but hating the fact that if it was true that young people would be having fun. And it's that policy of trying to ban cannabis, then rolled on to heroin and cocaine and MDMA. It's been the underpinning principle of American drug policy ever since. And the drinks industry, when they came back from the prohibition of the in 1933, they came back from prohibition. They decided to make damn sure they didn't go back the same way again. So they started a very effective disinformation campaign to stop people thinking alcohol's a drug. Say no to drugs, that way you'll have more time to drink. And it is still the time today. We're still finding in American states which are trying to legalize cannabis, the drinks companies are funding the people that don't want to legalize cannabis because they want to keep control of their market, which is probably the most profitable market in the world. Now, drugs have generally, starting off, been seen as being a good thing, and that nothing fits that bill more than the original war on drugs, which was the Second World War, which was fought on amphetamines. It was fought on different amphetamines. The Allied armies, the British and the Americans largely, they used amphetamine sulfate with a half-life of about 4 to 8 hours. The Germans and the Japanese, with their greater and more advanced pharmaceutical industries, decided to use methamphetamine, which is more potent and more longer lasting. And in the end, that did rather create problems for them because if you're taking methamphetamine on a regular basis, you actually become paranoid and you get somatic hallucinations. And in the end, it probably undermined their war effort more than amphetamine sulfate. But anyway, amphetamines were the savior of the Western world because our soldiers were on them. But as soon as it was over, they became hated. And the first attack on drugs was the attack on Purple Hearts and amphetamines in the 1960s, followed by attacks on things like meprobamate and methaqualone. And then came 1967, when Richard Nixon was trying again to be elected, having been beaten by Kennedy. And he was confronted with a serious problem because he supported the war in Vietnam, but most Americans didn't. And he was going to lose. No one wanted someone pro the Vietnam War. So his advisor here, Ehrlichman, came up with a really clever plan. He said, and this is what he said afterwards: our 1968 campaign had two enemies, the war on anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. I think they thought, could we do that? But not even the Supreme Court then couldn't. I mean, probably could now. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Hugely successful. Nixon turns against the war in Vietnam. People forget that. They fight a much more important war, a war in their own backyard, the war on drugs. Brilliant. He wins every state except Maine. And afterwards, Ehrlichman says, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And but that unfortunately, that statement hasn't rolled out. Most people who believe that drugs like psychedelics, MDMA and cannabis are harmful are still buying into those lies, actively ignoring the fact that even the person that invented them said they were lies. And that's why it's so hard to change anything, because it's very easy to make a law and very hard to change the law. Here's a couple of great quotes about lies. Charles Darwin: false facts are very injurious to science, for they endure long. And the psychologically more astute Mark Twain: how easy it is to make people believe a lie, and how hard it is to undo that. And that's the problem, undoing lies. If undoing a lie that people want to believe as a truth is very difficult. So, well, we've been fighting back in Britain. My charity, Drug Science, has been fighting back now for the last 10 years. since my sacking. And I'm going to tell you a bit about the psychedelic stuff and a bit about the MDMA stuff and a bit about the cannabis. I just want you to know over 1 million people every year in Britain currently are using illegal cannabis for a range of disorders such as depression, anxiety, chronic pain and arthritis. So they're breaking the law every day or every time they buy medical cannabis. Why? Because it's better than the treatments that they're getting from their doctors. Now here's a study we've done. We published 2 papers, 2 case-controlled series of children with severe epilepsy whose parents have discovered they can treat them with medical cannabis. And so we've got 20 patients now whose lives have been transformed. Look at these 2 here. Look, this red is before medical cannabis and black is after. There's no black. These kids have gone from having thousands of seizures a month to none. And overall, it was about a 50-fold reduction in seizure frequency. But the NHS refuses to pay for this treatment because they say there's no evidence. And we say, well, this is kind of amazing. What evidence would you need to convince you if you go through 1,000 seizures a month to none? And they say, got to do placebo-controlled trials. And we say, well, we don't need to do that because these kids have been on 7 other drugs before and they haven't worked. So you could consider those to be placebo, couldn't you? And they say, no, you've got to stop it and see if seizures come back. And you say, well, if you do that, they might die. And they say, well, it's the only way we're going to pay. And then some of the parents stop it because they can't afford it. And the kids do die. And then they just said, oh, sorry, well, they're dead, so we don't need to treat them anymore. It's truly just actually immoral and disgusting. What about psychedelics? Well, this is a very famous study. Now it's the first study we did, clinical study we did with psychedelics. Having done brain imaging studies to show that psilocybin was likely to reduce depression, we did a controlled trial. We took patients who'd had resistant depression. They'd all failed on at least 2 antidepressants. They'd all failed on CBT. We gave them 1 trip, 25 milligrams of psilocybin, and they all got better. And some got so better that they were well in the yellow line, and some are still well now, 8 years on. The majority relapsed, but it took them 3, 6, 9 months to relapse. Now, that's the most powerful treatment for resistant depression, the most powerful single dose treatment for resistant depression ever. And it's very sad that it's taken. It was probably known back in the 60s, but the banning of these drugs we had to relearn, and it's taken 50 years for us to relearn. Other people have done this work now. There are trials in end-of-life anxiety and depression with psilocybin. There's this nice trial from Johns Hopkins looking at people who stayed on the waiting list, didn't get any treatment, people who were given psilocybin, a single dose like ours, and they got better, and then these were switched over and they all got better. So we've got really quite compelling data now of the value of psilocybin, single dose or 2 doses to treat depression. There are now studies going on in OCD and pain syndromes and anorexia. And there have been several trials of ayahuasca in Brazil and in Spain, and they all show powerful effects to help lift depression and other internalizing disorders like as I say, the OCD stuff and the anorexia stuff hasn't really come out as much yet, but it will be in the next few years. And this is a study that we published just last year, and it's the first head-to-head of a psychedelic and one of the best of the SSRIs, escitalopram, and it shows 2 interesting things. It shows again how fast psilocybin works, and some of these were resistant depression, some weren't, but it works very fast and it's better overall than escitalopram on depressed mood. But both are pretty good at reducing depression. But on well-being, psilocybin is way better than escitalopram on well-being, and this is interesting because well-being is the opposite side of the coin to depression. And it may be that increasing well-being gives people resilience and helps protect them against subsequent depressive episodes. So we're quite fascinated by this phenomenon here. How do they work? Well, the reason we started doing studies in depression was because our brain imaging studies suggested that psychedelics produce a profound alteration in the way the brain works and the connectivity of the brain. It massively increases connectivity in the brain. And a couple of months ago, we published this paper in Nature Medicine showing for the first time in patients that this happens, that following psychedelic therapy, the patient's brains are more connected than they were when they were depressed. And the model is like this. In depression, the energy landscape of the brain becomes very stratified, very severe. The different networks of the brain, and there are multiple networks, but certainly at least 10 major networks, like the executive network, the default mode network, the sales network. They're more separated from each other than in the normal person. So the analogy I like to use is a bit like living in Switzerland, where you've got big mountains and deep valleys. And in Switzerland, you can live in a valley and you can speak German. And you don't even know in the other valley they're speaking Italian. There's just no crosstalk. And in depression, people get locked into valleys of thought where they can't escape from these negative, horrible thoughts. Oops. Psychedelics completely flatten. In the psychedelic state, the energy landscape of the brain is completely flattened, so that there's massive, massive increases in crosstalk. And it persists in recovery from depression. And this is at 3 weeks after people got a dose of psilocybin. Their brain is more connected. We've increased the flexibility of thinking in the brain, which we think explains why they feel better, they feel more able to deal with problems, etc. If you want to read more about it, you can read about the science, the neuroscience in this review here, from the depolarization of connecting neurons in the brain to the increased connectivity in the brain. But also psychedelics do something else, which was unexpected and important, which is they increase neuroplasticity. They increase the ability of neurons to talk to each other. They increase synaptic spine density, and they increase dendritic branching. And this neuroplasticity probably explains why the effect of psychedelics is so enduring, because you actually do change the brain. When you think the new thoughts you've got, the new way of approaching and rationalizing problems in your life, the new solutions you have to old problems are laid down in a brain, and they endure because your brain is more plastic. Just to finish off by talking a bit about addiction, because even today, I was at a conference in Denmark, some of the top psychiatrists in the world last weekend, and they were saying to me, you can't use psychedelics because they're addictive. And I said, why do you say that? Well, he said, they must be, because they're controlled Schedule 1 drugs under the UN conventions. And I said, well, that's just a lie. They're not addictive. They said, well, of course they're addictive. Otherwise, they wouldn't be controlled. It becomes a circular argument. But the reality is they're not addictive. And I'm going to show you now that they can be used to treat addiction. So here's someone I guess that most of you never heard of, but one of the, almost certainly the United Kingdom's greatest footballer, George Best, dying after his second liver transplant of alcoholism. We've had a treatment for alcoholism, which was invented or discovered by the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson had a psychedelic trip in 1933, which changed his attitude to alcohol. He stopped drinking. Suddenly, the room lit up with a great white light. I was caught in an ecstasy, which there are no words to describe. It seemed to me, in my mind's eye, that I was on a mountain, that a wind, not of air, but of spirit was blowing. And then it burst upon me. I was a free man. So this psychedelic experience broke the shackles of his alcoholism. So what did he do? Well, he set up Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was very successful. And then in 1954, I think, LSD was legal. He tried LSD, and he realized that LSD could do what his psychedelic experience in the 30s did. Well, that was actually almost certainly a hyoscine-induced psychedelic experience. And he thought, wow, LSD could be the cure for all these other alcoholics who can't have the experience that I've had. It could help open their minds to the fact that there's more to life than the booze. It could open up the minds of these cynical alcoholics. And he managed to persuade the US government to fund 6 trials of LSD in alcoholism. And a few years ago, 2 Norwegians went back, got the source data, and subjected it to a meta-analysis. And they showed here that 1 or 2 doses of LSD, as part of an abstinence-based program, could produce outcomes which are at least 2, probably 3 times better than any current therapy. And you can see my calculation there in the yellow box. In the 55 years since these drugs were banned, at least 100 million people around the world have died prematurely from alcoholism. And if LSD had helped only 10% of them, that would be 10 million lives prolonged. Now, how many lives have been saved by the ban of LSD? Well, probably none, but maybe 1,000. Oh, let's say 1 million. Let's say it deterred 1 million people who might have died. I mean, it's impossible, but let's just say that. That would still be 10 times fewer than the ones who'd have been saved. So the equation is so distorted because of the hysteria against these drugs. This political decision has actually essentially condemned tens of millions of people to die unnecessarily because we've denied them access to a treatment that would work. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. Now, there's been a study in New Mexico that psilocybin can also help people with drink problems reduce their drinking. Michael Bogenschutz showed profound reduction in alcohol consumption after this first single dose of psilocybin. What about MDMA, which I mentioned earlier on and come back to now? So here's a picture of the man that rediscovered it, Sasha Shulgin, and his wife. And he realized that this was a rather unusual drug. It was different from any amphetamine before or since. And he shared it with his wife, who said, this is remarkable. This gives you empathy and clarity of thoughts. You can actually, and she was a couples counselor, and she used it in her counseling sessions. I know thousands and thousands of sessions of couples therapy were done with MDMA back in the 70s. But then some greedy club owner in Texas realized that it was legal. He started selling ecstasy in his clubs. Kids liked it. It could help them dance and also love each other. It got to Ibiza. The rave scene started around Europe. The world went mad, and it got banned. And that was an enormous loss. Luckily, an organization called MAPS decided to hang in there and to see if they could resurrect or maintain the use. So over the last 30 years, through charitable money, they've managed to keep research on MDMA going. And it's a man called Rick Doblin who's pioneered this. And just last year, they published their first phase 3 trial of MDMA therapy for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a very difficult disorder to treat. So these are people with resistant PTSD who were given 2 or maybe this was 3 sessions of MDMA as part of a classical, traditional PTSD psychotherapy course. And what you see here are the changes in scores in the placebo group and the MDMA group over the course of their therapy. And you see here that at the end of the therapy here, less than a quarter of the people who got the MDMA therapy were still ill, whereas nearly 80% of those who didn't, who just got the placebo, were still unwell. So this is a very powerful effect, and the next trial is nearly finished, and when that's completed, it's very likely that MDMA will become a medicine. How does it work? Well, you can read about it in this little review I wrote in Nature Medicine. What MDMA does is suppress the emotions that are reactivated by the memory of the event. PTSD is par excellence a disorder where you can re-trigger the traumatic memories very easily, and those memories are not real memories. They're actually the experience of the event, and they just completely disturb your equilibrium. You might faint, you might run away, you might feel you're being shot. And MDMA those are amygdala responses, and the MDMA can dampen down those amygdala responses so people can re-engage in the therapy and get control over the emotions, and therefore get control over their PTSD. My colleague Ben Sessa and I, a few years ago, thought maybe we could treat people with alcoholism with MDMA, because we knew that a lot of people drink to deaden the pain of trauma. And so we did a study where we gave people like an 11-week abstinence-based course, a standard course to help alcoholics, get them sober, keep them in a course for 11 weeks and then see what happens. And what you see normally, what happens is that they're drinking a lot, they get sober, and over the next few months, 2/3 of them relapse to drinking again. But the MDMA group, over the next 9 months, in the end, only about a quarter relapsed. So there's a huge difference. MDMA, just 2 MDMA sessions here, had a really enduring impact, keeping people well for months and months. And again, this is a hugely exciting phenomenon because it does offer tremendous opportunities to treat people with alcohol problems. There's other ways we can deal with this. There's with addictions. This is a particularly innovative approach that the Swedes have used, the Swedish Match Company. This is called snus. This is a non-carcinogenic form of tobacco. You don't smoke it. You just put it under your gums, between your lip and your gums, and you just absorb the nicotine through your gums. And it's massively, massively safer than smoking tobacco. In Sweden, they've almost eliminated lung cancer in men because men don't smoke anymore. They just use snus. It's almost completely eliminated smoking in women in Norway since it's been available in Norway in the last 10 years. The British government refuses to consider it. They actively refuse to consider this, even though I've been writing to them saying, this is way better than vaping. And it's because it's got 40 years of proof, and they won't consider it because they're, I don't know why. I think because they're either in the pockets of some industry or they're idiots. So I'm going to stop now. I know you wanted to ask questions. I'll just remind you there's a few books of mine that you might want to read, and if you buy them, you can from Drug Science, the Drug Science website. You will support my charity, Drug Science. And if you write to info@Drug Science and say you want to buy the books, they will give you them at a very substantial discount. So thank you for listening. And any questions?
First, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Holistic. Sorry. That was such a holistic presentation on the history, and all of the political consequences and influence on it. Like a lot of those things I hadn't heard of before. Megan hadn't either. It was really interesting. So yeah.
Good. Well, have you recorded this?
Yeah, we have. Is that okay?
That's great. Why don't you give it to Drug Science and put it up on the Drug Science website then?
Okay.
Yeah, that would be brilliant.
Sure.
Sorry, we were a bit flustered at the beginning, so didn't get time to ask, but quite a few of our members also weren't able to make the call today. So they kind of requested, if it possible, we could share the recording. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Please send it to Drugs. Send me an email and I'll put you in touch with I'd love to have this on the website because I don't think this particular one is on the website. So it'd be great for others. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
And so are you comfortable taking a few questions for a while?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So opening up to anyone who's got anything they want to ask. Okay, so I actually had one to kick off. So going to the psychedelic research that you shared that showed kind of a energy profile resembling like the topology of the brain in depressed patients, I was just wondering how that energy profile was generated. So what that topological graph was actually representing. Because it's quite recent research. I've actually not seen those previously.
No, it's a schematic. It's just
like a demonstrable kind of example.
Yeah. So what we do, I mean, that's it's a schematic we put together to try to explain the phenomenon. What we know. So this is a schematic. Okay, it's in that paper. You'll see the data which shows the increase. This connectivity between these bits is less. But if you take all the valleys here, there's not much crosstalk, right? In the valleys here, the valleys are flat. The The mountains are flatter, so there's more crosstalk possible. And the psychedelic state, there's loads of crosstalk because there aren't any, everything's flattened. How do we know that? Well, we know that from this. When you look at connectivity in the brain under a psychedelic, there's massively increased crosstalk because the networks, which are normally very self-contained, their ability to be self-contained breaks down, and that's because the neurons which sequestrate the networks are disrupted by psychedelics. So they allow the brain to become much more connected. Now, of course, that's what you see in a trip. That's the question is, does that last afterwards? And in this particular study here, this Nature Medicine study, yeah, we showed that in two separate studies. In the first study, that was the depression study I showed you, the very first depression study, a day after, increased connectivity in the brain predicted outcomes at 6 months. And in the second study, that increased connectivity was present at 3 weeks after treatment, and that also predicted outcome. So we got two independent studies, both showing the same effects, increased connectivity related to the recovery from psychedelics.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you.
I've got a question that links to your one, so do you want to answer?
Yeah, okay, so I had another question as well. Given the vast history of drug use globally, which you spoke about during your presentation, and also the use by Britain specifically during their imperialism, and then also given the light of recent research, which has been very rigorous into the benefits of drugs for various kind of medical conditions, why do you think that the prohibitionary stance is still so strongly held?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because if we understood that, we might do something about it. I think it's a confluence of three very, very difficult things. The first is the lies. That's why I gave you the quote from Mark Twain. Mm-hmm. Very difficult, because to accept that you've been lied to and made a mistake is it needs a massive maturity, which most politicians, especially in many countries, won't admit to. Even if it wasn't they that lied, the fact that they perpetuated the lie in their policies means that they're also they're culpable, and they don't want to admit they were wrong. That's the first. The second thing is, and this is kind of surreal but true, because we saw this when Bolivia, 20 years ago, Bolivia said, look, we're in favor of cocaine being controlled under the UN conventions, but we would just like to remove the coca leaf, please, because people chew the coca leaf, and we'd like it just to be allowed to be legal, even though they were doing it all the time. I mean, you go to any Andean town and you can buy coca leaves, but they were still illegal. So Bolivians said, let us just take the coca leaf out of the conventions. We'll stick with everything else. But the United Nations went insane. They sent deputations to Bolivia to talk to the president to try to stop him doing this. The British government voted against him doing it, because there is this belief that if you change any law relating to drugs, the whole edifice will fall down. And I think, and that tells you something. It tells you how fragile the edifice is. But there are people who feel that actually think that the law is more important than the truth. And it's kind of absurd, but it's there. And then the third argument is the economic argument. If you go to Vienna, go to the conference center in Vienna, and then look, as you go to the conference center, look to the right. If you think that's a conference center, there's two buildings bigger than, each of them are bigger than the United Nations building in New York. And that's where the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, there's 10,000 people whose jobs are dependent on continuing to pursue these policies. If you change them, just like with Anslinger, if you get rid of these policies, they won't have a job. And they're going to keep producing evidence and evidence and evidence and evidence to support their position. And then there are countries in the United, the Americans are not so bad now, but they're still not brilliant. But I don't think they're absolutely campaigning as viciously as they used to, but countries like China and Russia and Indonesia and Malaysia have taken over. They like to execute people who use drugs. To them, it's a kind of, it's an entertainment. So, and the UN, as you know, it's a completely dysfunctional organization. It can't even get rid of Russia, even though it's waging war on it. So, the bottom line is, with these massive blocks of actors, which are all locked in together in a sort of malignant anti-drug approach. But the good news is we can change now. The fact is that, it's a number of countries have decriminalized drug use, like in Portugal. They haven't been banned from the United Nations. We could, if we wanted to, we could do that. The Scots have done it, and the war hasn't ended, and the Russians haven't invaded them yet. So the fact is we can change. The reason we don't change in this country is because our politicians are drug-using hypocrites who actually, again, like to pretend that they're innocent, even though they're not, and like to punish drug users. Why? Because most drug users don't vote. So it's it's the same thing. It's the war on drugs that Nixon started. Attack people. It will get in a way which will get you votes from the people that might be undecided. So it's complicated, but a whole multitude of very different negative factors.
I wanted to ask, like building on that, we've discussed with friends or like among society a few times how far in the future in the UK we think this kind of decriminalisation is, and I just wondered, what's your stance on that?
Well, obviously you should decriminalise personal possession of all drugs, like they police for first offences. That's done in Scotland, like they've done in many countries. They've done in Canada now. They've done in some states in the States. They've done in Portugal for 15 years. We know it works. We should do it, but we won't do it because they're still. The Labour Party are terrified of being rational about drugs because they know that then it'll just give the right-wing press a chance to attack them. And they'll attack them with a viciousness which is kind of beyond parallel. If you think the attacks on the sort of so-called anti-Semitism in Labour were ridiculous, if Labour was to be liberal on drugs, they would be attacked daily to the election, as we're going to destroy British society because we'll let young people take drugs. The only party that's got the balls to stand up to the Lib Dems. I don't think they're going to, and they've said they will have a Royal Commission on drug policy, and they said they will legalise cannabis. And isn't it interesting? The new German coalition has legalised cannabis. That's going to happen by Christmas. But in Britain, we're a very unusual country. You may not know this. We're the only country in the world that allows its press to be run by people that don't live in the country. So the Telegraph is run by people that live in the Barclay brothers, who live in France, effectively. The Northcliffes run the Mail. They live in France. Murdoch runs the Sun and the Times, and he lives in New York. And the major right-wing newspapers are owned by people who actually who just like to like to influence policy, even though they don't live here. And so we have one of the most disproportionately biased media in the world. And until we change that, it's going to be very hard because, for reasons I understand, they're all anti-drugs, even though happy to vote for people like Michael Gove, who's a self-confessed cocaine addict, but doesn't matter. He votes the right way.
Yeah, and I mean the bias is reflective in drug policy as well, right? So sorry if anyone else has any other questions. Just a final point on this, and then we can move on. I just wanted to ask as well, do you think, because the third point that you gave as to why perhaps this prohibitionary stance has been able to kind of fester in the way that it has, is the economic benefits that can be or that have come from the war on drugs. What do you think about kind of the economic benefits that could come from legalization of things like cannabis, for example, like we've seen in the US?
Absolutely. No. So there are the war on drugs has been an unmitigated economic disaster, except for the people waging the war.
Yeah.
It's wars are disasters for everyone except for the people that make the fucking guns. One of the reasons we got war in Ukraine is because there are a lot of people that actually want to sell weapons, and they're great, but the rest of the world is starving, so that these people who make guns, so it's part of this whole historical conflict that there's profit in it for some, and the ones who get profit have more influence with the politicians than the rest of us.
But do you not think that they would find the economic benefits from legalizing kind of drugs like cannabis equally or more attractive? Do you think that that could have,
No, I mean, the war on drugs fuels a lot of things. It fuels a lot of aircraft being built. It fuels a lot of fast boats that float around the Caribbean. It fuels a lot of people's jobs. As I said, you have to be extraordinarily mature to want to sacrifice your lifestyle for reason or rationality. Yeah, I mean, of course, that's why you have politicians. That's why you have parties. You expect leaders to make those hard decisions, like in Uruguay. I mean, the president of Uruguay decriminalized cannabis to prevent narco gangs from Brazil coming in and taking over his country. He did it in the face of massive, massive opposition from his government. He was part of, let alone the opposition, but he did it, and it's been transformational. So it needs people with courage. And I mean, when did we last have a politician with courage in this country? I mean, it's certainly before any of you were born. Well, at least in power. I mean, I think actually, yes, the Lib Dems and the coalition, they did have courage, but they were just completely lied to by the Tories. They were just naive innocents.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yes. So you've been talking a lot about the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics specifically, and obviously we've got a massive mental health problem in the UK, and I think it's being exacerbated at the moment by the cost of living crisis. But I was just wondering what your thoughts were on how it might translate into more widespread implementation once we hopefully get to a stage of approval.
Well, I've been on March 2020. I wrote an article saying the long-term consequences of COVID will be in mental health. They will be in people who get COVID and have problems with COVID, damaging their brain, which is quite a lot. And there will be in the people who are treating people with COVID, who are watching people die who they could have saved if they had the proper equipment. Half of all intensive care doctors, including one of my PhD students, who's given up medicine now because he was so traumatized by that, half of them have got PTSD because they watched people die, and they could have died themselves because they weren't properly prepared and things weren't. So we need to do something about that. And that was over 2 years ago. What did the government do? Nothing. We still do not have a task force to deal with the brain consequences of COVID. We've got multiple task forces to deal with viruses and different forms of viruses and virus protection. I mean, but we don't have any, and we don't care because we have a government that actually, it doesn't believe in mental health because it doesn't believe in anything. It kind of might be difficult and challenging. So as far as the current government goes, mentally ill people are just weeds. I mean, we've got an ex-health secretary who may yet be the next leader of the Tory party, who just tried to destroy medicine when he was health secretary, and now says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I got it wrong." You say, "No, you didn't get it wrong. You actively ignored what we told you. We told you. You just didn't give up." Okay? So basically, they don't care, and and actually, the Tories have never cared about mental health because they don't suffer from it much. They're all kind of psychopaths and arrogant psychopaths, and the ones in their family who do suffer from it, they get it treated privately. So, whereas Labour, actually, Blair Brown and the Blair Brown government did a great deal for mental health, and they were much more progressive. So that's one thing Labour would be better at than the Tories. It won't change the laws on drugs, but it will actually bring back more resources into mental health treatment, I'm sure. And then psychedelics could be revolutionary. But the problem is Labour are run by a guy who used to be putting people in prison for drugs. So Starmer would have to admit that he spent 20 years of his life doing exactly the wrong thing. And there has never been a politician who'd ever admitted that he's been so incompetent. He's not going to do it because it would completely, unless he's playing a clever game, unless he gets elected and then says mea culpa. But if he says mea culpa before then, the Mail and the Express and the Telegraph would just lambast him as being a liar. You know, he was like, you know, I mean, he cannot win. The only way he can win is to get elected and then hope the more open-minded members of the Labour Party actually manage to change him. He could do that. Maybe that's the game he's playing. I hope so.
I think as well, you said about like the neurological effects of COVID. I think that's quite interesting because there's been recent findings of like Epstein-Barr being linked.
Yeah, well, that's also with MS as well. Yeah, we're doing a study, by the way, now of cannabidiol.
They recently started looking at medical cannabis for long COVID.
Well, we've started.
Do you know anything about how that is going? Has there been any results?
Well, we've recruited 7 people. Yeah, it's going on in Yorkshire. Yeah, no, we started that trial. Drug science. There's a drug science trial. Yeah, we've got 7 people in already. It's a 6-month trial, so we won't know really to the end of the year. But yeah, at least it's going. It's happening. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We got a couple of minutes left, so if you've got one more last question, please. You don't have to, because I'm quite happy to go and get some food now, if that's all right. Well, don't lose the recording, please, and let's even get it up on our website. That would be lovely. All right?
Yeah.
That'd be brilliant. And thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was
Great.
really good.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.